Cedar Creek lay far from everything, at the edge of a forest, in the shadow of the mountains. The road to the town wound through dense pine woods, swallowing the light with each turn. I was driving along the twisting highway, glancing at the gray clouds hanging over the treetops. The air was heavy, and I could feel the rain coming. The town had been abandoned in a way, its existence sustained only by the mines nestled in the nearby mountains. The mines had once provided livelihoods for generations of miners, but now things were different. I'm Jonathan Cale, and my duty is to hunt those who hide their true nature. I grew up in a family of hunters. My father taught me how to track down and eliminate those who pose a threat to people. He was relentless and didn't believe in negotiations, and I learned a lot from him. But now my path is my own. Here in Cedar Creek, grisly murders had occurred. Several residents were found torn to shreds on the outskirts of town, and the local authorities decided it was an attack by a wild animal. Maybe a wolf or a bear that had come down from the mountains in search of food. Sheriff Thomas Miller had closed the investigation, convinced that everything was simple. But I wasn't convinced. I had come here on a special assignment. I often find myself dealing with situations that can't be explained by conventional means. Local laws and investigations of such cases often carry little weight when my line of work is involved. I had authority that no one knew about, and unlike the police, I had the means and experience to handle such matters. When I drove into town, Cedar Creek seemed frozen in time. Narrow streets coated in dust, old wooden houses with peeling paint, and almost no people outside. Just a few cars parked by the side of the road and closed shop doors. No one came out, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I headed for the sheriff's office, a small one-story building with a faded sign that read Sheriff stood in the town's center. The doors were open and a dim light flickered inside. As soon as I stepped in, I was met by Sheriff Miller. He was a short, stocky man with a piercing gaze and an expression that clearly showed displeasure. "You the hunter they sent?" His voice was calm, but I caught the tension. Miller wasn't happy about my arrival. "Jonathan Cale," I replied with a nod. "I'm here about the attacks. The state governor tasked me with conducting an investigation." "I've heard about you, pal. But we're a quiet town, and there's no room for extra investigations around here." The sheriff snorted. "It was just an animal. A wolf or a bear. You're wasting your time." I held his gaze, knowing his confidence was just an attempt to avoid extra trouble. Though most of the time, local authorities or law enforcement were willing to cooperate with me. It's not uncommon for them to fear me because I'm an outsider. Small, forgotten towns. They're like people with their own character and behavior. And sheriffs often were the most important figures in such places. But from my experience, it's in towns like these where something crazy usually happens. "I'm not here to disturb your town, Sheriff. But my authority, as you know, is not limited. I'll do what's required," I said. "If you're so sure, then you have nothing to worry about." He frowned, clearly not expecting that kind of response. "You act like you know something I don't, boy," Miller said, his eyes narrowing. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I knew conversations like these were pointless. All the case files were in the station, and I was going to study them. While the sheriff watched me, I realized he was hiding something. His reaction to my arrival was abnormal. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes I'm met as an unwelcome guest, but in this town, the sheriff was acting too aggressively, and his behavior made me suspicious. Maybe he knew more about what had happened, or maybe he was scared of what was happening in Cedar Creek. But that didn't matter. My job was to get to the truth, even if it was hidden under layers of fear and secrets. After my conversation with Sheriff Miller, I headed to a hotel one of his deputies had recommended. A small, single-story building on the edge of town looked like it hadn't seen a renovation in the past 20 years. I wasn't surprised. Towns like this rarely attracted travelers or tourists. The locals lived their lives, and strangers were met with caution, as had been the case with me. I parked the car by the main entrance and stepped into the lobby. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 60s, with short-cropped gray hair and a stern face. Her eyes carefully studied me, as if she was trying to figure out what had brought me to Cedar Creek. "Good evening," I greeted her as I approached. "Evening," she responded curtly, not taking her eyes off me. "What do you need?" "A room for a couple of days," I said, pulling out my documents and money, preferably close to the exit. She nodded, taking a key off the wall hook. "First door on the left," the woman said, handing me the key. "Not many people stay here long. I hope you won't have reason to complain." "It'll be fine," I replied, taking the key. Her words were casual enough, but there was something in her voice that triggered a sense of unease, fear. Something was going on in this town, and the locals clearly weren't in a hurry to talk about it. I headed to my room. The narrow corridor, dim lighting, and old carpet underfoot. Everything looked as neglected as the town itself. Opening the door, I glanced around. The room was simple, with one bed, a chair, and a small wardrobe. Nothing extra, just the basics. But that suited me. I wasn't here for comfort. Taking off my jacket and tossing it onto the chair, I sat on the bed, lost in thought. The locals clearly knew something. Every person I had encountered so far displayed some kind of strange tension, as if they were all waiting for something. Or maybe it was just the aftermath of fear. The town had experienced several brutal murders, and that was bound to leave a mark. My family had taught me one important rule: fear often hides the truth. People are afraid to talk about what they don't understand. And when it comes to werewolves, fear becomes not just a feeling but a defense mechanism. People prefer to believe that all the oddities around them are just figments of their imagination. I pulled the documents the sheriff had given me from my bag. The photos of the victims were unpleasant. Ragged wounds, mutilated bodies, but there was something else. One of the victims, a miner, had been found near an old tunnel that led deep under the mountains. The locals said the mine had been abandoned years ago after a cave-in, but if someone was using it as a hideout, that could explain why no one had seen the attacker. I planned to check out that tunnel tomorrow. If something unusual was hiding there, it might shed some light on the situation. Maybe the werewolf had found a refuge among the ruins of the old mine, using it as a den. It happened. Ancient creatures like to find themselves secluded places, far from people. A noise outside pulled me out of my thoughts. I went to the window and looked out. The moon, partially obscured by clouds, cast a dim light over the empty street. But I thought I saw a silhouette slip between the houses. It could have been just a local heading home. But the feeling of unease stayed with me. Closing the window, I decided that tomorrow I would start by talking to the local miners. Maybe they could tell me more about what had been happening in town before the attacks began. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. The room was dark, and the cold air seemed to seep into my bones. I lay for a long time, staring at the ceiling, contemplating the day ahead. The photos of the victims from the previous day wouldn't leave my mind, and I knew these weren't simple animal attacks. Leaving the hotel, I headed toward the center of town, to the old mine where, according to the sheriff, one of the murders had occurred. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of Cedar Creek's residents, their eyes following me with silent disapproval. It seemed they knew more than they were saying. Around here, silence was golden, especially when it came to the recent tragedies. The mine was on the outskirts of town, in a state of disrepair. The road leading to it wound through a sparse forest, and the closer I got, the stronger the feeling that something terrible had happened here. I stopped at the fence surrounding the old mine. A rusty sign warned that this was a dangerous area and entry was forbidden. But that didn't stop me. Walking past the abandoned structures, I inspected the surroundings. The mine looked just as I expected. Decay and ruin left behind by time. But something was bothering me. Tracks on the ground. Someone had been here recently. They weren't clear, as if someone had tried not to leave traces, but I recognized them. Paw prints. Not human, but not entirely animal either. A werewolf. I pulled out my flashlight and walked forward, illuminating my path. Inside the mine, there was dead silence. The tunnel's arches loomed overhead like a heavy ceiling that was impossible to shake off. I moved cautiously, each step echoing in the darkness. In one of the dead ends, I saw something that could explain what was happening. The walls were covered in old drawings, something like cave paintings. There were many of them, but the meaning was clear to me. They depicted ancient hunters fighting something that looked like a beast. A werewolf? A noise behind me made me freeze. Quiet, barely audible, as if someone had taken a step but then stopped. I turned off the flashlight and listened. In the darkness of the mine, it was hard to tell where the sound was coming from. But I knew someone, or something, was watching me. "I know you're here," I said quietly, trying not to show fear. There was no response, just silence, which seemed even thicker. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a presence. The feeling was as if something was lurking in the shadows, watching my every move. I slowly turned, shining my light on the wall. Nothing. But I knew that didn't mean there was no danger. At that moment, I heard another sound. This time, it was clear. Someone or something was very close. I took a step back, holding the flashlight high, and in the distance, I saw movement. A shadow darting through the corridor. It was too fast for me to make out details, but its size and shape were definitely not human. I knew this wasn't just an animal. I had found it again. This was my target. A creature described in myths and legends, but they are real and hide among beasts and men. The werewolf was nearby. It could sense me just as I could sense it. But this time it wasn't going to attack. It seemed to be just watching me. Maybe it understood that I wasn't just any man. Still, I decided not to take any risks and left the mine, leaving the tracks and drawings for more thorough study later. If there was a pack hidden here, my strength might not be enough. I needed to conduct a detailed investigation and prepare. It's unwise to rush into a fight when you don't know the battlefield. When I stepped out into the fresh air, it seemed to me that the forest around the mine had gone silent. Even the birds had stopped singing, as if they too sensed the threat lurking somewhere nearby. The next day, I decided not to rush. The mine had shown me only the tip of what lay behind these attacks. The werewolf hadn't shown aggression, but I knew that was temporary. Perhaps it was studying me just as I was studying it. Either way, I needed to understand what was going on and come up with a plan. I decided to spend the day questioning the residents of Cedar Creek. Informal sources of information were always more valuable than official reports. The locals knew more than they were willing to say, but they could be coaxed into talking if approached from the right angle. I started with the bartender at the local tavern. Despite the early hour, the place was already gathering its first patrons, mostly miners who came to drink before their day shift. The bartender, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and thick mustache, gave me a long look when I approached the counter. "Drink?" he asked, wiping a glass. "No, thanks," I replied, taking a seat. "I'm here on business investigating the recent attacks." He nodded, not surprised. Apparently, word of my presence had already spread around town. People here learned the news quickly. "Have you lived here long?" I asked. The bartender set the glass down on the counter but didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted off into the distance for a moment, as if recalling something unpleasant. "I've been here a long time. Came when the mine was still running full strength. Things were different back then." "And what about the recent events? Do you know anything about the attacks?" He shrugged, but I caught the hesitation in his eyes. He clearly didn't want to talk. "People are scared of animals," he finally said. "But wolves, bears, they're not the same as they used to be. I know it sounds strange, but something's changed over the past few years. The forest has changed." I didn't press him further. He'd given me enough information, though he might not have realized it. The forest had changed, and it was clearly tied to the creature I was hunting. Perhaps the werewolf wasn't the only one using these woods. Leaving the tavern, I headed toward the old mine on the outskirts of town. On the way, I came across a local miner returning from work. I decided to ask him some questions. Someone who worked near the site of the attacks might know something useful. "Have you heard about the attacks?" I asked as I approached him. The miner, a short man with a face smudged with dirt, looked at me warily. "Of course I've heard. Everyone's heard. We hardly go into the woods anymore because of it." "What can you tell me?" He glanced around, checking to see if anyone was listening, then lowered his voice. "I've been here 30 years, and in all that time I've never seen anything like this. People disappearing, animals acting strange. They say the woods are dangerous now. It used to be quiet around here, but it's gotten worse every year." "Have you seen anything yourself?" The miner fell silent, then leaned in closer and whispered. "A few months ago, while I was on a night shift, I heard noises coming from the old mine. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw a shadow. It was too big for an animal. I ran. I haven't gone back since." His words only confirmed my suspicions. Something was in the mine. And not just anything. This creature was acting cautiously, hiding its tracks. But I was sure that sooner or later it would reveal itself. When I returned to the hotel, the day was nearing its end. Tomorrow I planned to meet with the people who had worked in the mine before it was shut down. If they had seen anything unusual or knew anything about the past, it might help me piece together what was happening here. The next morning, I headed to the outskirts of town, where the former miners who had worked in the old mine before its closure lived. I needed answers about what was going on in Cedar Creek, and I knew that the old-timers might remember more than the younger workers I had met in recent days. The house of the first miner I intended to speak with sat in a small valley at the foot of a hill, overgrown with dense pines. As I approached, I was greeted by the sound of the wind whistling through the trees and the creak of an old fence barely holding together. The house looked as weathered as the mine, its wooden walls cracked, and the roof sagged in places, as if the building was giving in to the weight of time. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it opened. Standing on the threshold was an elderly man with deep wrinkles and silver hair, dressed in an old but clean shirt. His eyes were light and sharp, and I could tell right away that he wasn't the type to easily give up information. "Good morning," I said, trying to be polite. "My name's Jonathan Cale. I'm investigating the events at the mine. I was told you worked there for many years." The old man was silent for a long time, studying me. I knew that people like him were used to solitude, and the arrival of a stranger naturally stirred distrust. "You with the police?" he asked at last, squinting. "No, I work independently," I replied. "I'm just trying to understand what happened in the mine. I need to know what was hidden there." His face softened slightly, but his expression remained wary. He opened the door wider and motioned for me to come in. Inside, the house was simple but clean. The floor was covered with an old rug, and in the corner stood a small wood stove radiating warmth. We sat down at a wooden table, and the old man lit a cigarette, thinking about where to begin. "I was there the day of the collapse," he finally started, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "It happened over 30 years ago. I lost a few good friends that day. They said it was just an accident. The rocks caved in, and the mine was sealed. But I knew it wasn't that simple." I listened closely, not interrupting. The old man paused, lost in his memories. "That night? Before the collapse? We heard strange noises? We'd never heard anything like it before. Something howled deep in the mine, and it didn't sound like the wind. We thought someone was trapped down there, or maybe an animal had wandered in. But when one of our men went to check, he didn't come back. We found his body hours later, ripped to shreds. No one talked about it openly, but everyone knew there was something more down there." "A wolf?" "Or something like one?" I asked directly. He nodded, though there was fear in his eyes. "Maybe? We called it the beast. No one knew exactly what it was. But it killed my friend. After that, I never went back to the mine. The sheriffs covered it all up to avoid panic. But I know one thing. Something stayed down there. And it wasn't just an animal." The old man fell silent, extinguishing his cigarette, and I knew he wasn't going to say any more. But what he'd told me was enough. His words confirmed my suspicions. The mine wasn't just a workplace. It was the lair of something dangerous. Something that had been there for years, perhaps centuries. I thanked him for the information and returned to my car. The old man stood on his porch, silently watching as I drove away. He knew more than he let on, but I didn't push him. I headed back to the center of Cedar Creek. What I'd learned left no doubt. The old man spoke of strange noises, the attack on his coworker, and it all aligned with my suspicions. But the most telling thing was that he mentioned the authorities' silence. The sheriffs had covered up the incident to prevent panic, which meant that something had been haunting this town for a long time. By the time I returned to the hotel, dusk was already settling over the town. The fog, slowly descending, was thick like cotton, enveloping the houses as if hiding them from prying eyes. I decided it was time to prepare for another visit to the mine. I needed to learn more about the drawings I had found and gather more evidence that the werewolf, or whatever was lurking there, was tied to the past. That night I sat in my room, studying maps of the mines. Old documents I found in the archives showed that deep tunnels stretched for miles beneath the mountains, and much of it had been sealed off after the collapse. But not all the entrances were sealed. I noticed one that, according to the documents, led to an older part of the mine, long abandoned even before the miners started actively working it. This tunnel hadn't been used in ages, and it could be the beast's lair. The next morning, I set out again for the mine. The air was cold, and the leaves rustled underfoot as I approached the site. I circled the perimeter, following the map I had studied the night before. Soon I found the entrance, almost hidden beneath debris and leaves. But after clearing some of the passage, I uncovered a narrow path leading inside. The cave seemed deep, its walls covered in moss and tree roots, a reminder that no human had set foot here in a long time. Occasionally, the dim light from my flashlight reflected off wet stones, casting strange, living shadows. The wind's howl occasionally broke the silence, but I knew that something more awaited me down here. After walking a little further, I stumbled upon another set of drawings on the walls. But these were different. They seemed older, cruder. The hunters were there again, but their opponent was clearly not an animal. The creatures depicted had human-like forms, but with long claws and fangs. I ran my hand over the wall, feeling the cold stone. These drawings told a story this town had long forgotten or chosen not to remember. At that moment, I heard a rustle behind me. Quiet, barely audible, but I tensed immediately. The werewolf was close, and I knew it was watching me. I turned off the flashlight and froze, listening. My legs didn't move, but my heart pounded in my chest. The air felt alive with the presence of something. The silence became unbearable, but I didn't dare move. In the darkness, I felt something slip past me, a shadow too quick to be a normal animal. And then complete silence. I turned my flashlight back on, illuminating the empty passage. No one there. But I knew this wasn't the end. This creature wasn't attacking. It was just following me, studying me. Perhaps it was waiting for the right moment. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, images of those ancient drawings on the mine walls filled my mind. There was something unsettling about them, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the werewolf was behaving unusually. This predator was smarter than I was used to. It wasn't attacking right away, preferring to observe and wait for the right time. But I knew its patience wouldn't last forever. The next morning, as the first rays of sun broke through the thick foliage, I made up my mind. Today, I needed to act more decisively. I returned to my car and checked my gear. In addition to my weapons, I had silver bullets that had been passed down through my family for generations. I rarely used them, but I knew the time was close. Werewolves don't die as easily as regular beasts, and I had to be prepared. Before returning to the mine, I decided to talk to more of the locals. Perhaps someone knew more than I could find in the archives, or from the old men whose memories had been blurred by time and fear. I needed to find those details that could point to why the werewolf had chosen this mine as its den. I headed to the house where a family lived, one that had lost a member during the recent attacks. They were new residents, having recently moved to Cedar Creek. They might not know everything about the ancient legends of this place, but their memories of the events should still be fresh. When I knocked on the door, it was opened by a woman in her 30s, with tired eyes and a pale face. She looked wary, but upon realizing who I was, she let me in. We sat at the table in a small but cozy living room. On a shelf, I noticed several photographs. A husband, wife, and 2 children, all smiling against a backdrop of nature. A family that was once happy in this place but had now lost part of itself. I know it's hard to talk about this, I began, trying not to be too abrupt. But I need to know more about what happened. It's important if I'm to stop what attacked your family. The woman lowered her gaze, her hands nervously fidgeting with the edge of her dress. Her voice was quiet, but filled with pain. "It happened at night," she began. "We were asleep. But my husband woke up because of some noise. He went outside to see what it was. I heard his scream. When I ran out, everything was covered in blood. But I didn't see the creature. It was too fast. He was just gone." Her eyes filled with tears, but she continued. "Our neighbors said it was wolves, but I saw something moving on 2 legs. It was too big for a person, but not quite an animal. I don't know how to describe it." I nodded. Her description matched what I already knew. Werewolves could walk on 2 legs, concealing their beastly nature, but they were far more dangerous than ordinary predators. "Could it have come from the forest near your house?" I asked. She nodded. "Yes, I think it came from there. The forest has always felt strange, but now it seems almost foreign. I feel like there's something wrong there." I knew I had to return, but now I realized that the hunt would be more difficult than I had anticipated. This creature knew the area better than I did, and it wasn't reckless. Perhaps it was one of the primal ones, those they called the supreme werewolves. Returning to my car, I paused for a moment before heading toward the forest, knowing for sure now that the threat originated there. When I reached the forest edge, I stopped, glancing around. Silence once again enveloped the place. I grabbed my flashlight and prepared for what awaited me inside. The forest was old. The trees here had grown tall and thick. I knew that in these dense thickets, something more than just a beast lurked. The supreme werewolves, as they were known in ancient legends, were predators of the highest order. They didn't strike without a plan. They acted with cunning and calculation. I was ready, but I understood that this hunt would be unlike any before. My flashlight illuminated the path, and its beam cut through the dense foliage. Around me stood ancient trees, tall and powerful, their trunks covered in moss and vines. I moved slowly, listening to every rustle, peering into the shadows between the trees. Sometimes it seemed like something dark flashed in the distance, but every time I turned, nothing was there. I was nearing the center of the forest. As I ventured deeper, the air grew heavier, as though the place itself was steeped in something ancient and sinister. The light breeze that occasionally played with the leaves had stopped, and the silence became truly oppressive. I understood that this place was part of legends that had lasted for centuries. Perhaps this forest had been home to werewolves far longer than Cedar Creek had existed. At one point, I came across tracks. They were fresh, and their shape left no doubt. Paw prints, too large for an ordinary wolf, but too distorted for a human. I stopped scanning the area, feeling the tension building inside me. The werewolf was nearby. It was no longer hiding, but still hadn't attacked. Maybe it was curious about me. What did it want? What was it waiting for? My experience told me that these creatures were always cunning. But this one was special. If it had decided to reveal its tracks, it could be a trap. I wasn't going to rush headlong into a confrontation. Werewolves knew their territory by heart, and if it was luring me deeper into the forest, it had a plan. I crouched by a tree and examined the tracks. There were several of them, leading further into the forest toward some old ruins, the ones drawn in the mine. I was certain those ruins connected to the mine. It became clear to me that the werewolf was headed there. I pulled out my weapon, loaded with silver bullets, and got ready. I also injected myself with a special serum to heighten my senses and increase my body's strength and endurance. He could be waiting for me there, and I needed to be prepared. Slowly, with each step toward the ruins, I could feel the air growing thick, almost oppressive. This place was not just a hideout for the beast. It had power of its own. Perhaps he lived here, having absorbed ancient forces that made him so dangerous. The ruins appeared before me suddenly. Old stones, covered in moss and sunk into the ground, looked lifeless, but I could feel their hidden energy. "Why are you hiding?" I said quietly, though I knew no answer would come. The silence was absolute, but I knew the werewolf was nearby. He could attack at any moment. With each passing second, the tension mounted. I could feel my muscles tensing, ready to pounce. The serum I had injected was already taking effect. My vision sharpened, my hearing picked up the faintest rustle, and my heart beat steadily, like a predator ready to hunt. A few seconds passed, but it felt like time had stopped. The werewolf wasn't attacking. I circled around the crumbling stones, carefully inspecting every corner, trying to guess where he might emerge from. The tracks had led me here, but he wasn't showing himself. And then, as if out of nowhere, a silhouette emerged from the shadows. He was enormous, far larger than I had anticipated. The werewolf stood on two legs, his powerful muscles rippling beneath coarse black fur. His eyes glowed with an amber light, full of both animal instincts and something far more intelligent. He didn't make any sudden moves, just observed me, studying me as I was studying him. I didn't move, gripping my weapon tightly, ready for an attack, but he didn't charge. The werewolf continued to stand still, as if waiting for something. His breathing was quiet, but in this silence, I could hear each exhale, like the sound of thunder before a storm. "You've been waiting for this moment," I said, feeling my voice echo in my chest. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he understood my words. This was not just a beast acting on instinct. The supreme werewolf, an ancient being, living for decades, if not centuries. He knew who I was, and that I was hunting him. I took a step forward, tensing my muscles, preparing for the fight. My weapon was ready, but the werewolf still didn't attack. Instead, he took a step to the side, as if showing me he wasn't going to fight right now. It was unexpected. Werewolves usually attacked without hesitation, but this one was different. It was as if he was offering me a choice, to leave or to continue. But I couldn't just walk away. I had come here to end this, and I realized that this encounter wasn't by chance. Perhaps the werewolf was testing me, gauging if I was ready for what would come next. His power was evident, and I knew this battle would not be easy. "What do you want?" I asked, hoping to somehow grasp his intentions. The werewolf tilted his head slightly to the side, as if in thought. His form flickered in the shadows, as though he was part of the forest itself. But in the next moment, his eyes once again gleamed with that same dangerous light. This beast wasn't going to speak, but his actions spoke for him. He slowly turned and walked deeper into the ruins, as if inviting me to follow. I knew it could be a trap, but I couldn't afford to lose him. I had to find out what he was planning. Following him, I moved deeper into the dark corridors of the old ruins. My weapon was at the ready, but the werewolf showed no aggression. He was just leading me somewhere. We moved deeper into the forest, and I could feel the air around us growing heavier, laden with ancient power. I followed him until a massive stone chamber hidden underground opened up before me. The beam of my flashlight revealed only part of the space, but I saw enough to understand. This was not just a hiding place. This was a sanctuary. The werewolf stopped in the center of the chamber and turned to face me. His eyes no longer looked malicious, but there was expectation in them. At that moment, I understood that our battle was inevitable, but it had to happen here, on his territory, in a place that was sacred to him. Several days before these events, my eyelids barely lifted and the world around me filled with darkness and the damp scent of earth. My body remained motionless, as if encased in stone, but I could feel each cell slowly coming back to life. Years had passed, perhaps decades or even centuries since I had fallen into slumber. Time had lost all meaning, but with that came complete oblivion. We are the ancient ones, and for us, hibernation was merely a moment. But this world had surely changed. My brothers, they too had begun to awaken. I heard their heavy breathing, saw them stir beside me. They were younger, more foolish, more primitive than I was. Their bodies resembled beasts, long limbs covered in coarse fur, sharp fangs ready to tear flesh apart. They looked like wolves, but their minds were undeveloped. For them, awakening meant only one thing: hunger. The thirst for the hunt. I slowly rose, feeling my muscles finally obeying me. The stones and earth surrounding us were part of these minds. We had been buried here too long, and now it was time to return to a world that might have already forgotten us. My claws dug into the cold stone floor, and I realized that our strength had not yet fully returned. We were weak. But the hunger was unbearable, demanding blood. I could feel their impatience. My brothers, those born after me, lacked the wisdom and self-control. They lived by instincts alone. Their minds, if one could call them that, focused on one thing: the hunger for the hunt. Their movements were jerky, almost uncontrollable, like predators that had recently awakened from a long sleep. I slowly ran a hand over my chest. The scars I remembered before my slumber were still there. Each one a reminder of the past, of the battles we had fought. But now before me lay a different world. I could sense it in the air. This world had changed. It no longer held the fear that once ruled over humanity, the fear we used to dominate. We went into hibernation after our kind was nearly wiped out. The humans who had once trembled before our power grew stronger. They created weapons that could kill us. We were forced to retreat, to hide in the shadows to survive. But now something had disturbed our sleep. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing. This awakening was no accident. My brothers awaited my signal. They, like me, could smell the living. Humans. Those who worked in the mines were close. Their sweat and blood filled the air around us. We were predators, and they were our prey. But I knew I had to be careful. We hadn't regained our full strength yet, and the hunt had to be for survival, not for cruelty. I took a step forward, and my brothers followed me. They growled, ready to pounce at any moment, but I raised a hand, stopping them. In this world, I was their leader, their supreme. I was the one who led them to victories. But now they had to understand that hunting was not just a desire to feed. It was an art. We moved slowly through the tunnels, drawing closer to the scent of the living. The stones of the mine were slick with moisture, and their cold seeped into my bones. Around us, dead silence reigned, broken only by our breathing. We walked on earth that hadn't known our strength for a long time. This place had to become our new home, but first, we had to assert our claim. But before that, we had to sate our hunger. When the first lights appeared before us, I knew the time for the hunt was near. In the darkness of the mine, Time seemed to stand still. My brothers moved beside me, no longer waiting for orders. I could feel their impatience as they prowled through the shadows, their paws treading silently on the damp stones. Hunger sharpened their senses, but it also clouded their minds. They needed to feed, to regain their former strength. But I knew this hunger couldn't be satisfied as quickly as they wished. We were weakened, and every mistake could be our last. We approached the flickering lights in the distance. Humans. They were so close I could hear their breathing, see the light from their lamps bouncing off the mine walls. These were not the humans we had known in the past. Warriors who had fought us face to face. These were weaker, unsuspecting of the danger. They worked, unaware that death had already crept up on them. My brothers began to growl like wolves before an attack. They wanted to lunge forward, tear flesh apart, satisfy the hunger that gnawed at them from within. I felt the same hunger. My claws clenched, and the blood inside me began to boil. But reason was stronger than instinct. I stopped, raising a paw, calling them to silence. Their wolfish instincts obeyed me. They knew I was their leader. They halted, not fully understanding why I was delaying the attack. To them, it was a simple hunt, swift and straightforward. But I knew that every step had to be calculated. We had just awakened, and we didn't know this world. In this new time, we couldn't act by old rules. I crouched, pressing myself to the ground to better feel the vibrations. The mine was old, and it had many hidden passages leading deep into the mountains. These tunnels stretched farther than the eye could see, and they could be used for hiding or setting traps. But for now, we just needed to survive the night. We crept closer to the first figures of the humans. Their silhouettes flickered in the dim light, unaware of our presence. They were absorbed in their work, the clanging of pickaxes against stone. At that moment, I caught the scent of blood. One of them had been injured. Perhaps a miner had accidentally hurt himself. For us, this was the signal. The blood awakened primal instincts. My brothers couldn't resist. One of them lunged forward without waiting for my command. His powerful body moved so fast that the humans didn't even have time to notice him. His claws tore into the first miner, and the man let out only a short scream that echoed through the tunnel. Blood splattered the walls, and my brothers, one by one, joined the hunt. I watched. My mind told me we were rushing. But right now, we had no other choice. We had to restore our strength, and this was the only way. I slowly approached the dying man, feeling the scent of blood saturating the air. My claws touched his body, and I saw fear in his eyes. It was a fear I recognized. It was the same as I remembered from many years ago. My brothers continued to tear flesh, and I allowed myself to savor the moment, feeling our ancient power returning. We retreated into the shadows of the mine. Our bodies were sated but not fully restored. The miner's blood had helped us regain some of our strength, but I knew it wasn't enough. We were still weak after our long sleep, and the world around us had changed so much that we couldn't yet understand where or with whom we would clash in the future. My brothers followed behind me, breathing heavily. They hadn't yet realized that the world we had awakened in no longer belonged to us. They thought only of their thirst for blood, of the next hunt. But I felt something different. The air was thick with threat, and it made me reflect on our past, on the times when we ruled these lands, when humans were our slaves, feared us, and worshipped our kind. We walked through the mines, following the tunnels that stretched deep underground. These tunnels connected to ancient ruins which had been our refuge, the place where we found rest in our long sleep. The ruins, these were all that remained of the days when our kind ruled these lands. I could still feel the ancient power there hidden beneath the stones and moss. It was the place where sacrifices were once made in honor of my father, the Lord of Werewolves. When I was very young, my father was the ruler of these lands. He wasn't just strong, he was revered as a god. People feared him but worshipped him at the same time. Every year they made sacrifices, bloody offerings that strengthened our connection to the world and empowered our kind. I remember how people would line up, bringing their captives, and my father would choose the best for sacrifice. This ritual was essential for maintaining our dominion. My mother, who was no less powerful, taught me the ancient rituals. She always said that strength wasn't just in the might of the body, but in the knowledge passed down through generations. It was she who taught me the ritual of hibernation, which we used much later to escape humans. But back then, in my childhood, I didn't know that one day we would need that knowledge to survive. My brothers, the younger ones, had not yet reached their full potential. They, like me, were part of this world but didn't understand its depths. We all believed in the power of our Father, in his invincibility. He was the symbol of our kind's eternal rule. But then the humans began to change. They became stronger, braver. At first it was only rumors. Humans began building fortresses, defending themselves, and they stopped making sacrifices the way they used to. Father initially paid no attention to it, confident in his power and in the belief that humans wouldn't dare challenge his kind. But that was a mistake. I remember the day they attacked our home. It happened suddenly. Humans, armed with strange blades and armor, came from the northern lands. They brought with them not only ordinary warriors, but also beings we had never encountered before. These creatures were faster, stronger, and smarter than regular humans. They moved like shadows, attacking with unparalleled precision and speed. These were not just warriors, they were our mortal enemies, hunters, specifically trained to battle our kind. My brothers and I didn't have time to react. Our home was destroyed within hours. I saw my father standing in the center of the battlefield, his massive figure towering over the enemies. He was tearing them apart, one by one, but each time, new hunters took their place. They fought as one, their attacks precise and merciless. My mother fought beside him, her claws and fangs gleaming in the fight, but even she understood that their strength was not enough. That was the first time I saw one of our kind die. My father fought to his last breath, his claws ripping through the enemies, but he couldn't hold out. I watched as his body fell to the ground, torn and battered. In that moment, I lost not only my father, but also my belief in the invincibility of our kind. My mother, realizing that we could not win this battle, ordered me to take my brothers and flee. Her growl was cold and decisive. She knew it was our only chance at survival. I dragged my younger brothers and led them into the mountains. We fled, leaving behind destruction, screams, and death. We hid in the mountains for many days, waiting for the enemies to leave. Every day I thought about how our strength was both our protection and our weakness. Humans had learned to fight us. They were no longer the pitiful creatures that once trembled before us. These hunters, these strange warriors who had come with the humans, were stronger, faster. I didn't know who they were, but I understood that we were no longer safe. When we returned to the ruins weeks later, I found that our home was destroyed. Everything that had once been sacred was now dust. My father and mother no longer protected us. We were alone in this world. But that didn't mean we had given up. I began to take revenge on the humans. We attacked villages, slaughtered their livestock, took the lives of their warriors. Every time I tore a human apart, I remembered that day when my father fell, and rage filled me. My brothers followed me. They too thirsted for revenge. We became phantoms, living in the shadows, and every time the humans tried to reclaim their land, we would come to remind them who the true predators were. But I knew it couldn't last forever. The humans were growing stronger again. They built fortresses, honed their skills, and soon I realized we would have to run once more. I knew that if we continued to attack, sooner or later, those hunters would return for us. But this time, they would destroy us completely. My primary goal now was to protect my brothers, even if it meant disappearing from this world for a time. My brothers, though they followed me into every battle, didn't fully understand the danger we faced. Their minds were clouded by bloodlust, revenge, but they didn't see the bigger picture. Then I remembered my mother's words. She had spoken of an ancient ritual performed by our ancestors in times of great danger, when our kind faced the threat of extinction. It was the ritual of hibernation, a ritual that could hide us from the world for centuries. It would give us the chance to restore our strength, so that centuries later we could return when time had forgotten us, and humanity would once again become vulnerable. My brothers didn't understand what I had planned at first. To them, the idea of hiding seemed cowardly. But I knew it was the only way to survive. The night I decided to perform the ritual was cold and moonless. We gathered in the ruins where sacrifices had once been made in honor of our father. The stones, covered in moss, still held the power of those times. I could feel the ancient energy coursing beneath the earth, ready to respond to my call. I gathered my brothers around the sacrificial stone and began the ritual. Gradually, my brothers calmed, their bodies succumbing to the power of the ritual. I felt their hunger, rage, and thirst for revenge fade, replaced by peace. As the ritual neared its end, I could feel the earth itself embracing us. Our bodies sank into a deep sleep, and our consciousness began to slip away. I knew this was only a temporary state. We would sleep for centuries, but one day we would awaken. As my brothers fell into slumber one by one, I allowed myself one last look at the world I would soon leave behind. A world that had once belonged to us, now destroyed. But I knew that time was on our side. Humans might grow stronger, build cities, forge new weapons, but when we awoke, they would not be ready. I closed my eyes, feeling the forces of the ritual completely envelop me. After the memories of the past flooded back, I felt the old pain once more. The past we couldn't escape always haunted us. But now I knew we had a chance for a new hunt, for a rebirth. We had returned to the ruins, but I knew it wasn't enough. My brothers were hungry, and the strength we had regained from the first hunt was already fading. Though my brothers were calmed for a time after feeding, their impatient nature began to resurface. They wanted more. I too felt the hunger, but I understood that this world had changed more than we could have anticipated. Strange scents hung in the air. Unfamiliar sounds filled the night. After a short rest, I decided we needed to return to the mines. Where the humans were, we could feed again and quench our hunger. These humans seemed weaker than those who had come in times past, and I thought they posed no serious threat. My brothers were already ready for the fight, their claws scraping the ground, their eyes burning with bloodlust. We silently made our way deeper into the mines, moving like shadows, until we reached the place where the miners had recently been killed. And that's when we saw them. Humans. But not as I remembered them. They were strangely dressed, their clothing tight, made from materials I had never seen before. Their faces were covered by odd helmets, and they held long iron rods in their hands. I had never seen such weapons before. They weren't swords or spears like those I remembered from my time. These things seemed alien, terrifying. The smell. I sensed something strange in the air. It was a scent I couldn't identify, like fire mixed with earth and iron. The feeling disturbed me, but my brothers, as always, were too impatient. They wanted to attack. Stay! I tried to hold them back, but they were too excited already. Hunger had overpowered their minds, and they charged forward. Then it happened. A loud, explosive sound filled the mines. It was thunder, but not the kind that comes from the sky. It was thunder from those strange iron rods the humans held. I didn't have time to understand what was happening when one of my brothers fell. His body was struck by something invisible, his blood staining the ground. Another shot, and my second brother collapsed, roaring in pain. One by one, my brothers fell, their bodies broken by these incomprehensible attacks. I was furious. I couldn't comprehend how this was happening. We, the ancient hunters, were falling before ordinary humans who weren't even clad in iron armor. I felt madness taking over me, remembering everything I had done to save my brothers, all the centuries we spent in hibernation, all our losses. It was too much. I couldn't let these creatures defeat us. I lost control. The roar that erupted from my chest echoed throughout the tunnel. I lunged at the humans, not thinking of the consequences. Their weapons might have slain my brothers, but I knew they couldn't kill me. I was different among my kind. Their strange iron rods couldn't compare to the ancient powers coursing through my blood. I attacked the humans, feeling rage and fury consume me. The sounds their strange iron rods made were like claps of thunder rolling through the tunnels. These loud explosions filled the mine, making the walls seem to tremble. I didn't understand what their weapons were, but I knew they were killing my brothers. When I reached the first of the humans, his eyes widened in terror. My body, driven by rage and desperation, surged forward, and his life ended before he could do anything. I tore him apart like a fragile doll, but the others kept fighting. Each time their iron rods exploded with that deafening sound, my mind clouded with the pain of those I had tried to save. I watched as the bodies of my younger brothers fell one by one. Their blood soaked the stones, seeping into the ground as if it wanted to swallow them whole. They were weak, too young to understand what was happening. All my efforts to protect them were in vain. Rage turned me into a crazed beast. I lunged at anyone who dared raise a weapon. They couldn't withstand my strength. I tore their bodies apart, ripping them to pieces. Their faces twisted with fear as they realized that neither their weapons nor their thunderous blasts could stop me. I could feel their fear growing with each torn body, with each life extinguished in the mine. But at some point, when I thought it was all over, I saw one of them, the one who was their leader, retreating. He had a metal star on his chest. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't try to stop me. Instead, this man slowly backed away, leaving his people to die under my claws. He was abandoning them to save his own life. I sensed his cowardice the moment he turned and began to flee, leaving his people behind. This traitor, this man with fear in his eyes, was guilty of my brother's deaths. He knew his weapon couldn't stop me, and the only thing he could do was escape. My rage still boiled inside me, but my body was starting to give in. I could feel something tearing at my flesh, and my wounds weren't healing as quickly as they once did. The strength I had lost during hibernation had not fully returned. I needed to recover, but I couldn't stop as I watched the traitor flee. I took a few steps forward, but my body refused to obey. The wounds inflicted on me were beginning to take their toll. I struggled to stay upright, but I knew I couldn't let this man get away. He had to pay for my brother's deaths. I had lost them all. Everyone I had tried to save had perished before my eyes. But I was too weak. I couldn't catch him. I saw him disappear into the darkness of the tunnel, his footsteps growing fainter. I knew this wasn't the end. This man would survive, and he would return with new people with new weapons to finish what they had started. Wounded, I realized I couldn't continue the fight. My body needed time to recover, and I knew my revenge wouldn't come today. I turned to look at my brothers' bodies, lying in pools of blood. This was the end of our kind. Everything I had fought so hard to protect had been destroyed in mere minutes. I had to leave. Leave so that I could return. My vengeance had only just begun. In the days following that massacre, I spent my time alone, licking my wounds. I was weakened, the injuries I had sustained in the battle with the humans healing slowly. The strange strikes from their weapons had penetrated my flesh deeper than I had expected. I knew I couldn't return to the humans too soon. I needed time. Every morning, I awoke in the damp forest, feeling my strength gradually return. Hunger gnawed at me from the inside, but I knew that attacking humans now would be reckless. I decided to focus on hunting wild animals to regain at least some of my strength. The forests surrounding these lands were full of game, and I could sustain myself on their flesh, but it was nothing compared to human blood. I hunted deer, wolves, and even bears, trying to satiate my insatiable thirst. Each new kill helped restore a portion of my lost strength, but the pain of loss still lingered inside me. My brothers had died in mere minutes. That memory hung over me like a heavy weight. While I recovered, I observed the humans from a distance. I watched how they moved along the roads, how they lived in their towns. Their way of life had changed beyond recognition. They were different now, not like I remembered. Their strength no longer lay in their bodies as it had in ancient times, but in the strange inventions they carried with them. They had grown weaker physically, but those iron rods they wielded were far more powerful than any sword or spear. The humans built homes from stone and wood, but they no longer feared as they once had. Their towns were full of lights and movement, and the fear of the forest seemed long gone. They no longer trembled at what lurked in the shadows of the trees. But I knew they were mistaken. Their weakness was obvious to me, and I knew it was time to remind them of our power. Weeks passed before I resumed hunting humans. These were selective attacks. I didn't target those who were armed or surrounded by others. I chose those who were alone, wandering through the forests or fields far from their homes. These hunts helped me regain my former strength. But each time I killed, I thought of my true enemy, who had yet to be found. Everything changed one evening when I decided to return to the mines. This place had become a symbol to me of both our victories and our defeats. The mines were quiet, but I knew something more was hidden there. The place where we had died was connected to ancient forces, and I felt that this place might hold the answers I sought. The day I returned to the mines, I found a man there. He was alone, unarmed, and his clothing was different from the others. He wore strange but durable attire, as if he had come not to fight but to study this place. His movements were calm, yet deliberate. He moved, inspecting the walls of the mine, his gaze focused as if he were searching for something specific. I decided to sneak closer to get a better look at him. My instincts told me this man was unusual. But as I approached, I felt something I hadn't felt in centuries. His scent was strange. It was a smell I hadn't encountered since before my hibernation. It was the scent of blood, but not just any blood. It was the same blood that flowed in the veins of those ancient warriors who had destroyed my home. I froze. This man was not ordinary. I sensed that his blood was infused with ancient power. It was the blood of hunters, those born to fight us. I couldn't attack him right away. Something held me back. This man was dangerous, and I knew it wouldn't be easy to kill him. I needed to learn more about him before rushing into battle. Perhaps he was the last of those ancient warriors I had once encountered. I decided to watch him, to study him. I had to understand who he was. I observed this man for several days. He explored the mines, carefully inspecting the walls as if searching for something specific. But the hunter sensed me too. I noticed how his movements changed. Sometimes he would stop and listen to the silence of the mines. He knew I was there. Once I even heard him quietly speak words as if calling me out. He wanted me to reveal myself. He knew he was being watched. I was still too weak to attack. Though my wounds were healing, they still reminded me of the recent battle. I understood that I couldn't engage in combat with this being. He was too dangerous. Hunters of his kind had already proven their strength in the past. I had seen how they fought and knew that a simple attack wouldn't be enough. This man wasn't just a hunter. He was something more. His blood carried the power to destroy beings like me. So I decided to wait. Time was on my side. The hunter wasn't attacking, and I wasn't going to strike first. I chose to study him, to learn his weaknesses. I followed his every step, watching as he returned to the city the humans had built on these lands. That city was strange to me. The streets were filled with enormous iron creatures, lifeless inside, moving while spewing smoke and noise. These soulless creatures seemed strange and repulsive to me. Their scent irritated my senses, and I couldn't understand how the humans could tolerate it. I saw the hunter moving on one of those iron creatures. This world had become alien to me, and I couldn't comprehend how everything had changed so much during my hibernation. I continued to watch the hunter. He frequently returned to his strange house. There he rested, but I could sense that his thoughts were focused on hunting me. I knew he was gathering information about me too, about what had happened in the mines. He was cautious, but I could see that he was preparing for our encounter. But my revenge was drawing nearer. I wanted to destroy this city, just as the humans had destroyed my home centuries ago. I had to avenge my brothers, whom I had lost because of these people. And I had to find that man, the coward with the iron star on his chest, who, like the others, was involved in my brothers' deaths. He had to die. I began to devise a plan. The hunter was strong, and I knew I couldn't defeat him in open combat. But I also knew that I could use my advantage, my territory. The place where I was born, the place that held ancient power. The ancient ruins where our home once stood still held the power that sustained me. I decided to lure the hunter there to the sacred place. Those ruins were part of my strength, and I knew I could use their energy to defeat him. It was time to end this hunt. I couldn't let him remain in this city. I was ready for the final battle, but this time, I knew I had to act smarter. I set a trap. The hunter would follow me to the ruins, where I would use the power of my kind. There, in my sacred place, he would meet his death, and I would finally avenge everything I had lost. From Jonathan Cale's perspective, before me stood a creature unlike any other. It was powerful, strong, its body moving with the grace of a predator, but in every muscle there was an ancient might. This was a supreme werewolf, not just any beast, but a being born in the distant past when the world was different. Its claws were long and sharp like daggers, and its teeth gleamed, ready to tear flesh. I knew it was far tougher and more resilient than any other creature I had ever faced. I could feel its power emanating from this place. These ruins, this ancient home of its ancestors, were the source of its strength. It had led me here deliberately, to draw upon the ancient energy, to feed from the walls that had once protected its kind. But I knew this was a trap. And I had come to this trap willingly. The werewolf had decided to show himself, and I couldn't miss this chance. He was cunning enough to escape, and then I would have had to hunt him down across the entire state. I didn't want to play cat and mouse with him, and I was fortunate that he had chosen to lure me into a trap. The werewolf moved slowly in my direction. I knew he relied on his heightened senses, his smell, hearing, and sight. He counted on those instincts to defeat me, just as he had defeated others before me. But I was ready. At that moment, I pulled a smoke grenade from my pocket, a homemade explosive that could create a loud noise and blanket everything around us in thick smoke. I threw it hard against the ground in front of me. The grenade exploded, releasing a thick wave of smoke that quickly filled the space between us. The werewolf was instantly disoriented. I saw him slow down, alarmed by the strange smell and the sharp noise that shattered the silence. His nostrils, trained to catch every scent, were overwhelmed by the smoke, and his eyes couldn't pierce the thick fog. But he still lunged at me as the smoke spread through the ruins. I felt his movement and jumped to the side, dodging his attack. In that moment, I grabbed my weapon and fired. Silver bullets whistled through the air, aimed straight at the beast's chest. But he was faster than I expected. He dodged, and the bullets only grazed him. The werewolf roared with rage, his eyes glowing in the darkness. He charged at me again. His claws came within inches of my face, and I dodged once more. But he was too fast. His powerful swipe knocked me back against the wall of the ruins, and I felt the impact reverberate through my body. I hit the wall hard, but I didn't lose consciousness. The serum in my veins gave me the speed and durability I needed. I got to my feet, but the werewolf was already halfway toward me, ready to strike again. I rolled to the side and fired once more. This time, the bullet hit him in the leg. I heard him howl in pain, but it didn't stop him. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The werewolf charged at me again, his claws tearing through my jacket and leaving a deep gash across my chest. The pain was sharp, but I couldn't afford to show weakness. I felt blood begin to seep from the wound, and for a moment, my head spun. But I knew I couldn't allow myself to fall. The werewolf struck me again, and I was thrown against the wall once more. This time, I collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. The werewolf, seeing my weakened state, didn't waste any time. He quickly rushed at me, his claws ready to deliver the final blow. He wanted to finish me, to end this fight, but I knew I had one last chance. My body was drained, but my hunter's instincts didn't fail me. At the last moment, just as his claws were about to tear into my flesh, I rolled to the side, avoiding the strike. His claws slammed into the stone wall behind me with enough force to shred steel. I knew I had only one shot left. I grabbed the weapon that had fallen from my hands when I hit the wall, and gathering all the strength I had left, I aimed. The werewolf, enraged by his missed attack, turned toward me, and I fired. The bullet flew straight into his head. In that moment, time seemed to slow. I saw his eyes widen in surprise and fury. He hadn't expected this strike. He hadn't expected that I could deliver a fatal blow. His claws flashed once more in the air, but then his body froze. The werewolf slowly tilted forward, his gaze still locked on me. Hatred and the realization that his life was slipping away flickered in his eyes. For a few more seconds he continued to stare at me, as if trying to understand how this had happened. But then he collapsed to the ground. His body stilled, and silence returned to the ruins. I breathed heavily, feeling the pain in my chest intensify with each passing second. My wounds were severe, but I knew I had won. I slowly rose and walked toward the werewolf's body. His eyes were closed, his heart no longer beating. This was the end. My enemy had fallen. The sky had just begun to lighten, gray shadows still cloaking the streets of Cedar Creek when I parked my car outside the sheriff's office. The town was quiet, almost lifeless. No one had any idea that a battle had taken place on the edge of their world. I stepped out of the car, feeling the wounds from the fight with the werewolf pulsing. But time heals even these things. My clothes were torn, but that was a small price to pay for what I had been through. I walked toward the sheriff's office, the cold wind biting at me, carrying the scents of the forest now cleansed. The sheriff was already waiting for me. He stood behind his desk, brow furrowed, clearly not sure what to expect from this meeting. But he knew I was here for something important, and something had changed since I arrived in town. "It's over," I said, stepping inside. "Your town is safe now." The sheriff was stunned. You killed it?" he asked, sinking into the chair behind his desk. I shook my head. "Just know it's gone, and you'd better stick to the story you've already settled on." I answered firmly. "Stick to the official version. Let everyone believe it was just a wild animal. People don't need to know more. If you start spreading rumors about what really happened, it'll only bring trouble." The sheriff wanted to argue, but he stopped himself. He knew I was right. People weren't ready to accept the reality that there was more out there than they imagined. Their lives were too comfortable, too simple to comprehend that monsters could be real. "And one more thing," I continued, leaning in closer. "My work stays in the shadows, understand? You and your people brought peace to this town. Isn't that what you wanted? And if anyone asks, you'll say everything was under control from the start. Don't mention my name or what you know about me. Everything stays as it was." The sheriff stared at me for a long moment, but eventually nodded. Walking back to my car, I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and within moments I was back on the road. The locals would wake up and return to their everyday lives, never knowing how close they had come to destruction. I drove through the town, watching in the rearview mirror as it faded into the distance. Another mission was completed. But ahead of me lay new battles, new hunts. The world was not as simple as it seemed, and I knew this better than anyone.